So then, as I begin recording this video, we are barely a month away from the moment of truth. At last, we'll find out if Denis Villeneuve really has managed to deliver on a faithful, good Dune adaptation. Part 1 was pretty good, but if he doesn't stick the landing a second time, all we're left with is a pretty decent first half of a story. As an unrepentant source material Puritan, I have my own share of likes and dislikes with regards to Villeneuve's Dune. Once again, the Mentats are overlooked and ignored, Piter is little more than the Baron's flunky, and because the suspicion and intrigue subplot over who is the traitor is mostly breezed through, Thufir Hawat fares little better. On a more positive note, I do enjoy how a lot of the technology in Dune is portrayed. The still suits look great, the ornithopters look amazing, and I have no idea who settled on this depiction of the Holtzman shields, but give that person a raise. And on that note, let's talk about the Holtzman effect, and specifically how it impacts the society of Dune. The Holtzman effect does 4 different things in the universe of Dune, and none of them are really gone into great detail because that kind of technical hard sci-fi was not Frank Herbert's focus. So hard sci-fi fans, don't hold it too much against the man. Anyway, the Holtzman effect is responsible for the following. 1. Suspensors, basically anti-grav technology. You can make something float, that's the Holtzman effect. 2. Glow globes, essentially a self-perpetuating source of light. Again, Herbert doesn't really go into any detail as to how that works. 3. Space travel. It's almost a baby's first mistake for new Dune fans in that they make the assumption that the navigators are the ones that fold space, allowing for faster-than-light travel in the Dune universe. Rather, the navigators, as the name implies, are able to safely navigate through folded space. The actual space folding is again a product of the Holtzman effect. Finally, and most significantly for the purposes of this video's subject matter, the personal shield. Dune is by no means the first sci-fi to feature melee combat as the preferred form of engagement. That sort of thing has existed in the genre ever since the pulp era. That said, Dune is possibly the most famous example of melee combat in the future, and that's once again entirely down to the Holtzman effect via the personal shield. A form-fitting force field that, when activated, renders the user completely immune to projectile weaponry moving above a certain speed. You're never given any numbers as to what that speed limit is, but again, that's not really the focus of Dune, and that's not what people come to this universe for. All that really matters is that because of the Holtzman effect and the personal shield, not only are guns out of the question, but so are bows, spears, and even laser weapons. Because apparently if you shoot a personal shield with the latter, you essentially cause a nuclear explosion. The only time where combat in Dune is not settled by knife fight is when someone decides to use forbidden atomic weapons. Rather than merely what it does though, it's how the personal shield has shaped the society and universe of Dune that has always been the most fascinating to me personally. Admittedly, a good chunk of this is going to be headcanon on my part, so by all means take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. But I would make the case, particularly if you happen to ignore anything other than the original Frank Herbert books, that the Holtzman shields helped make the aristocratic society of Dune possible. It all comes down to weapons and how much time and effort it takes to get good at using them. In many ways, at least according to archaeologists and anthropologists, while division of labor has always been a thing in human society, the concept of specialized classes or professions only became possible through the adoption of large-scale agriculture. Mostly because this now means that you don't need every single member of a society to be dedicated to obtaining food. If you don't need everyone to get food, that means that an increasing number of people can dedicate their time to other specialties. Artisans, scholars, tradesmen, and of course, warriors. Of course, given the fact that, quoting Starship Troopers, violence is the supreme authority from whence all other authority is derived, it should come as a surprise to no one that almost every single society ever conceived by humanity has almost always been led by the warrior class. Even, for example, in India, where technically the priestly Brahmin caste were the most superior of all, Their authority was purely spiritual. Actual political power rested in the hands of the Kshatriya warrior caste. Also, recall that for the majority of human history, warfare and killing was done up close and personal. Yes, archery and spear throwing has been a thing since the caveman days, but with the exception of horse archer cultures like the Mongols, it was all melee combat. There's no firing off a few shots and then ducking behind cover like in modern-day firefights. Not only are humans pretty tough to kill up close, which is kind of surprising given how squishy we tend to be, but in melee combat, in order to get close enough to kill your enemy, you also have to get close enough for him to kill you. Because of course, you're both trying to do the same thing to each other. The point is, close quarters combat is hard against an opponent that can fight back. Therefore, in order to be very good at killing people at close quarters, requires years, if not decades, of training. In most pre-modern warrior cultures, you started learning as a child, and were expected to be at least proficient by the time you had achieved manhood. And of course, to achieve mastery of the art of killing at close quarters takes practically a lifetime. Of course, today, thanks in large part to the invention of firearms, combat is entirely different from when it was before. Most of the time, you're killing at a distance. And while combat is still physically and mentally demanding, there's a lot less you need to be able to know to kill proficiently with modern weapons than in days of yore. Mostly you need to be able to aim, fire, and be quick enough to duck back in case someone shoots at you. Maybe back in the day when you still had to reload your gun after every single shot, melee combat had a lease on life. But once we figured out how to incorporate magazines and automatic fire into guns, that was it. And while soldiers are still trained in close quarters combat today, that's more of a just-in-case kind of thing. Most of the time, soldiers are trained to kill their enemies before they have to get close enough for that to be a factor. Besides rendering melee combat effectively obsolete, it's simply easier to learn how to kill proficiently with a gun than it is with a melee weapon. All you have to do is aim and pull the trigger. Now, of course, to become a true marksman, that still requires years of training and practice in order to achieve such a level of mastery. But the point I'm making is that it doesn't require a lifetime in order to train someone to be at least competent at fighting and killing the enemy with a firearm. You don't need a lifetime of training like you did with melee weapons. As such, violence no longer became the sole province of an elite warrior class. You might say that the gun democratized the ability to inflict violence. Anyone with maybe a year or even mere months of practice can become at least proficient at killing with a modern gun. There's also the matter of social status. In the old days, to openly carry a weapon was the mark of nobility in many cultures. Famously, when Imperial Japan decided to abolish its old feudal class system, it demanded that the samurai class give up their swords, the symbol of their status. And many samurai responded by rebelling. Granted, they lost, but the point still stands. There are also examples of cultures where people of lower classes were explicitly forbidden from owning weapons. Makes it harder to resist the abuses of your supposed social betters if you can't fight back effectively. This not only explains why so many totalitarian regimes always seek to disarm their populace, but also why people like, say, the Founding Fathers sought to enshrine the right to own weapons in one's defense into the Constitution. Not only as a protection against criminals or an oppressive government, but also by bestowing such rights upon even the poorest Americans, allowing them to claim a small modicum of the dignity that had once been ascribed only to aristocrats. Now, in the world of Dune, you introduce a technology that renders all of that obsolete. Firearms are effectively worthless in combat. War has been returned to the realm of close quarters combat. And so violence becomes once again the monopoly of that small group that has the time and/or resources to train to kill effectively, or to those who have the money to hire said people. This is what I've always found so fascinating about the personal shield. Prior to the 1960s and what became known as New Wave science fiction, sci-fi was governed entirely by this sense of optimism, that as we learn more, as technology becomes more advanced, things are just going to get better and better. We're going to be more free, more equal, more prosperous, more positive things, etc. Dune was one of the very first sci-fi to challenge this optimistic vision of the future, to posit the idea that even with advanced science, things might still get worse. Things might in fact regress in a way. And again, while it's never really the focus of any of the Dune stories, the Holtzman shield is the perfect example of technology that actually would go against the trend towards more freedom, more democracy, by once again rendering violence the monopoly of a small elite. Even today, it's still a rare example of technology that, rather than furthering human development as conceived by most people today, it actually retards that development, helping to take humanity back into a world of aristocrats and kings and emperors. Dune has always been an ominous vision of the future, in stark contrast to the optimism of the sci-fi that came before it. And the personal shield is a great way of warning people that while technology can sometimes make things better, there is also the possibility that it can also make things worse. And that is a sci-fi prophecy that will always be relevant.